This is the story of two teenagers, Marco, 17, Beatrice, 15. We will follow their lives over a period of 10 years. The action takes place in Rome and Paris. Marco is the son of a working-class family and lives with his parents in Rome on 12th floor of a housing project. Italian state builds these houses for people of the low social classes. He is shy and reserved. In contrast to his environment, where the kids are generally arrogant and often violent. In certain situations, however, he can show the kind of determination and courage which command respect. He is passionate about the doves that he keeps on the communal terrace on the 15th floor. Beatrice lives with her parents in a house on the hill right opposite the building where Marco lives. Beatrice house is a villa, as we intend in Italy with the name of Villa Elegant House. It is summer. She is sunbathing in the garden, and every so often she takes a dive in the swimming pool. These two kids do not know each other, but one day Marco buys a pair of binoculars so he can observe his doves in flight. While watching them circling in the clear July sky, his gaze falls on a house on the hill. He adjusts the focus and for the first time sees Beatrice. She is beautiful, with long curly hazel-colored hair and a stunning body. Marco is immediately captivated. An insane desire to know her burns inside him. Unfortunately, this won't be easy. He is aware of the wide social gulf that separates them, and this stops him from making any kind of attempt at the day go by, and he becomes more and more frustrated when the dove come unexpectedly to rescue. In the heat of the summer, they cool off from time to time by diving into Beatrice's pool. When Marco notices his habit of there, he is euphoric and devises an unusual way in which to get in contact with the girl. His idea is to attract attention to the doves by tying long colored ribbons to their feet together with messages reading, "Hi, my name is Marco, and I'm watching you from a building opposite your house. If you want to call me, my number is 34. He does not lose any time before putting his plan into action. He calls for all his feathered friends and ties 3 yards of colored ribbon to their legs. Then he sets them free. Obviously, the doves do not fly straight to the swimming pool, but after a week of trying, Marco finally achieves his objective. Beatrice notices a dove playing in the pool, and thanks to the fact that someone has tied a long ribbon to its leg, she catches it as easily as if she were taking a dog by the lead. So Marco gets to know Beatrice. She calls him and they meet. Fate has decided that Beatrice should be strongly attracted to Marco. It is the beginning of a long and intense love story, of the kind that only teenagers are capable. It goes on for months. Unfortunately, however, Beatrice's father, a successful lawyer, cannot tolerate his daughter's relationship with a boy who is uncultured and, even worse, working people class. On more than one occasion, he shows his steadfast opposition by badly humiliating Marco. For Marco, this is a distressing period. He regrets not finishing high school. He resents his parents for their ordinariness, and as if all this was not enough, after a fight over scooter race, someone kills his doves as a revenge. He feels as if the world is falling in on him. He feels as if he does not have the will to carry on. He is experiencing one of those critical adolescent periods which could lead down the road to drug abuse or even suicide. During this time, Marco starts hanging out with certain people. They often go to Piazza Navona, a very ancient square in Rome. This is where Marco meets a rich and distinguished Frenchman of about 50 years old, called Alan. This is how they meet. Alan had been shopping and had a lot of parcel. He asked Marco and his friends to help him carry them to his home near the Spanish Steps, for which they would be generously rewarded. The 3 kids, penniless as usual, did not need to be asked twice. Alan's apartment was splendid, with views over the famous steps. There were objets d'art everywhere, from paintings to ornaments, and even a finely inlaid grand piano. Marco, who possessed an innate aesthetic sensibility, looked around, enchanted. He was struck by one painting in particular and asked, "Is this an original Ferrazzi?" The question surprised Alan. He would never have imagined a kid from the wrong side of the tracks would ask such a thing. He asked the kid how he had been able to recognize. The artist even thought the work was not even signed. Marco explained that he had always been interested in the arts and humanities at high school. Alan's curiosity was aroused, and he asked him whether or not he graduated. Marco lowered his head and confessed that he had had to leave his studies before graduation because his family could not afford to keep him at school. Alan was touched and made a suggestion. He explained that in 5 days' time he would be moving back to Paris for good. He offered to take Marco to France and enroll him in a top school. Marco was very flattered by this proposal, but replied that he would have to think it over and that he would give his decision within the 5 days. At this point, Alan took 3 crisp, new 100,000 lira bills from his wallet for the 3 kids in return for their help. They were feeling embarrassment but delighted and thanked him with exaggerated gratitude. On the way home, his 2 friends warned Marco of Alan's attentions for, as far as they were concerned, that distinguished gentleman had to be homosexual. Marco had also realized this from Alan's delicate and effeminate ways, but his proposal seemed like a sign from above, enabling him to liberate himself from his own condition. After all, what we'd be leaving behind but ordinariness adds squalor. But now a glimmer of light had appeared before him, showing him the way to a better future. After just 2 days, he decided to accept Alan's offer to travel to Paris with him. Besides, Marco had just turned 18 and was free to decide for himself what he wanted to do with his life. Alan was indeed homosexual, but he acted purely as a patron toward the boy, never expecting sexual relations of any kind in return. As promised, he immediately enrolled Marco in the top private school in Paris, and he graduated in just 2 years. It must be said that Marco and Beatrice always kept in contact by mail. Beatrice had suffered badly after Marco's departure, but time had eased her sadness, and in the end they decided maturely to call a stop to their relationship, with the hope and intention that they would one day meet again. So, with the right financial support and his own personal efforts, Marco climbed steadily, step by step, up the social and cultural ladder. Meanwhile, Beatrice's family started to notice an economic decline. Her father's passion for playing cards had led him into the hands of money lenders who stripped him of all of his assets. In the end, he was forced into bankruptcy. Beatrice, now 19, had to start working, putting to good use the grade school teaching diploma that she was lucky enough to have got. She would teach in a nursery school run by nuns and rented a modest apartment, which she shared with 3 of her workmates to minimize the costs. Despite all this, she finally enjoyed a period of tranquility and even began a new relationship. More years went by. Marco graduated from university. Alan was proud of him and organized a party in his honor. This would be the climax of Marco's achievement. Right in the middle of the party, Alan called for the attention of all guests. It was time for a speech, a public eulogy to Marco. At the end of his speech, there was a loud round of applause, but Alan again called for attention. There was another surprise. Alan introduced a new pupil into society for the first time. The name of the new boy is Adrian. Nobody knows where he came from. Alan announced that he would give Adrian the right start, which would lead him to a degree, as he had with Marco. Once again, the room burst into applause. Marco had known nothing of this and was a little hurt that it had been kept hidden from him until the last moment. Now Marco was 25 and continued to live with his patron. But now there was Adrian, too. In the beginning, living together was peaceful, but somewhat cold. Before long, however, Marco realized that there was something wrong about Adrian's character. Adrian had heroin addiction, and not even all the money that Alan generously handed out was enough to satisfy his needs. Marco realized that small valuable objects kept disappearing, and that Adrian was selling them and using the money to feed his expensive habit. He tried to tell Alan tactfully, but he was not really interested. Alan was so wrapped up in his passion for Adrian that he would probably have forgiven him anything or even denied that it could have been him. So Marco decided to catch him red-handed in the act of performing one of his countless little thefts. He succeeded in doing so, but provoked a violent brawl with kicking, punching, and swearing. Alan had been sleeping at the time, but was woken up by the din and ran in to see what was happening. Marco explained the facts, but Alan, with little regard for impartiality, simply replied, "Two's company, three's crowd." Marco understood what those words meant, and so he decided to leave. Alan gave him enough money to be able to live in Paris for 1 week and dismissed him. Marco had been so honest during all those years that he had not saved up a penny. He realized that he would have to find himself a job, and quickly. He had always thought that he might like to be a journalist. So he applied for a job at Le Figaro newspaper. They hired him, but only as an Italian/he applied for a job at Le Figaro newspaper. They hired him, but only as an Italian/French translator. However, he showed greater potential, and after a year, he became a reporter. The month continued to pass by. Marco was more and more impressive in his new role of reporter. Everyone was astounded by his brilliant intuition, but he worked with such modesty that he never provoked rivalry or jealousy. One morning, however, when he was reading the Paris news section of Le Figaro itself, he read that an elderly homosexual had committed suicide because his young heroin addict lover had contracted the terrible illness that showed no mercy. Marco wept, feeling a deep and genuine sadness, because despite everything that happened, he still felt very fond of Alan. From this tragic personal experience, a determination grew within him to try and discover what had caused this plague to be unleashed on the earth, a scourge unworthy of even the most vengeful of gods. So, with the permission of his editor, who gave him carte blanche, he began his investigations into the matter. His inquiries brought him into contact with people from completely different worlds, from drug users to interviews with doctors, biologists, and homosexuals. He entered all the data he gathered into his computer, and it soon became clear that there was a statistic anomaly that no one seemed to have noticed. None of the heroin addicts from the 70s who had stopped using the drug before 1980 had contracted the disease, even if they had been addicted for many years. On the other hand, those who had continued beyond 1980 had fallen ill, as had those who began using heroin after 1980. There is not normally any difference in the natural capacity of any two individual human beings to combat illness. So why did drug users of the 70s not become ill, while later addicts contracted the disease even after having used a drug for only a short while? What was the factor that determined this difference? Among the many biologists Marco interviewed, there was one who told him that laboratory experiments had been conducted into some unidentified viruses, created with restructured DNA. Their terrible potential remained dormant until they came into contact with blood, as liquid had helped them to unleash their destructive power. As soon as Marco learned of the scientific research, he was struck by a flash of intuition. Deliberated contaminated heroin. There could be no other way. It was the only clear and logical explanation of the problem. Marco came to the conclusion that the motive behind this contamination had been the total eradication of drug addicts from the face of the earth. They were seen by authorities as an army of mercenary zombies and potential source of spies who, in the pay of hostile countries, would have been able to undermine the national security of the so-called civilized nations. The governments of these nations had brought about this state of affairs. They had financed scientific research leading to the development of the dormant virus. This was then used to contaminate various large consignments of confiscated heroin, which were then put back on the streets through conventional channels of organized crime. The contamination had taken place on various occasions, and was still happening perhaps. Marco also figured that, in this way, these civilized governments would have managed to defeat the drug pushers as well. With the loss of their regular clients, they would have lost their huge financial gains through which they were able to corrupt and kill. With the weakening of their power base, i.e. their access to huge amount of money, they could be easily dealt with. Marco brought his conclusions to the attention of his editor who, however, raised a question. How come this plague has also struck certain tribes in Central Africa that have never had anything to do with heroin? Marco explained that whoever had contaminated the heroin, before doing so, would have wanted to verify its effectiveness on humans. So, with the pretext of vaccinating these people against smallpox, they actually infected them with the new virus, which soon began to develop. These tribespeople were nothing more than unwitting and unfortunate guinea pigs. The editor raised another question. He wanted to know the dynamics of the virus transformation from its dormant to its active state. Now, Marco replied with an example. Have you ever seen that medicine in capsule form? Well, the capsule is not the actual drug. The drug itself is the powder put inside the capsule because it tastes too bitter to be taken on its own. When you swallow these pills, the outer casing of the capsule dissolves on contact with water and releases the drug itself. You may be wondering why I've given you this example. Well, heroin is not easy to contaminate, so they had to invent not only the virus, but also the means by which to carry it. They had to ensure that it would not die despite being in an alien habitat, at the wrong temperature and without sustenance. The time from the contamination in the laboratory to the absorption by the drug user might be quite long, days, weeks, maybe even months. However, microbiology allowed them to create a capsule exactly like the one containing the medicine I was talking about before. Only this one is 100 smaller than a pinhead. You probably still don't know why I'm telling you this. You see, the capsule contains the ideal conditions in which the virus can survive for as long as necessary, a bit like a chicken and egg. These egg-like capsules are as big as the grain of heroin with which they were mixed. So, when the drug addict injects the heroin, his blood acts like the water when you take an ordinary pill and dissolves the capsule containing the virus, finally releasing it into its ideal habitat, the human body. Marco was making serious accusations. This was a scenario clandestine and specifically target genocide. Having heard these explanations, the editor agreed to let Marco write an article on his theory. But through basic common, since it ended up as a short piece on the 5th page, written in conditional tense to give the idea of a hypothesis rather than a verified news item. That would probably have been the end of the matter if one of the most important French television networks had not invited Marco on their highly popular Saturday night talk show to discuss the results of his investigations. The program went on air and Marco, in front of millions of viewers, revealed his theories, accusing former governments of genocide and present-day governments of hypocrisy, and conspiring to hide the truth from the public. Marco immediately felt the consequences. He began to receive numerous anonymous telephone calls warning him to stop his research. In the street, he was often almost run down by a car, too often to be by pure chance. His house was broken into and ransacked several times. In the face of this obvious intimidation, Marco turned time and again to his editor for advice. Eventually, he managed to persuade Marco to return for a while to Italy, at least until things had calmed down. He could continue to work for Le Figaro from Rome as an overseas correspondent. So, before the worst could happen, Marco left for Rome. He did so with some reluctance, as by now he felt himself to be a Parisian by adoption, but the risk of staying weren't worth running. There was just one thing that made him happy about returning to Rome. Perhaps he would get the chance to meet up with Beatrice. In fact, in the last few letters that he had received from her, she had written that her new relationship was now over. On the airplane, Marco tried to imagine Beatrice would be like now at 24. In his mind, he pictured her as beautiful. Incredibly, they had never seen each other again in all the years that had passed. Marco had not warned her of his return to Rome because he wanted to surprise her and also to see if she would recognize him. Marco was enjoying imagining the scene of their reunion. He knew both where she lived and where she taught. It would not be difficult to find opportunity for a surprise meeting. On his arrival in Rome, Marco rented a large farmhouse just outside the city. After he had been in Rome for a month, he felt himself reasonably well established. Everything seemed calm, with no trace of threats or attempts on his life. He decided it was time to meet Beatrice. That morning it had rained, heavily, but like a typical day in May in Rome, all at once the sky turned blue. It was 1:30 p.m., and Marco was waiting outside the gate of the school where Beatrice taught. Parents were crowding round, talking amongst themselves. The daily routine had created a kind of bond between them. Marco stood alone, talking to no one. He was nervous, knowing that in a few moments he would be seeing Beatrice again. The first children started coming out, laughing, jumping around, one of them crying, showing the first few teeth in his gummy mouth. All of them 5 foot old at most, some blonde, some dark, boys and girls together. They were pushing and chasing each other, kissing, saying goodbye. Then they were on their way home, hand in hand with their parents. Then another group of children came. Out! They were quieter, better behaved, and gathered around their adored teacher. One could see in their eyes the effect of their irresistible teacher, so young, so beautiful. As soon as he saw her, Marco, too, was spellbound. Most of all, he recognized her long brown hair and realized that this was Beatrice. His heart beat faster, and when all the children had finally left off besieging her, Marco drew closer to her and asked gravely, "Excuse me, miss, where's my son?" Beatrice looked at him and replied, "Your son? But who is your son? They came. She stopped mid-sentence. Her mouth fell open in surprise. They came. She stopped mid-sentence. Her mouth fell open in surprise, lost for words. And then, with her eyes shining, "It's you. It's really you. Marco." Marco replied with a slight nod. They looked at each other again, without breathing. Finally, they fell into each other's arms, not care about whoever may be nearby, parents, children, and in the background, several nuns discreetly watching, moved by and sharing in their joy. Those teenage feeling and mutual physical attraction had not changed a bit with the passing of the years. Perhaps it was increased even more by their desire to make up for lost time, like interest accruing in a bank account, waiting to be spent. Straight away, Marco told Beatrice all about the real reason for his return to Rome, and stressed the fact that hanging out with him would be dangerous for her. In reply, Beatrice said that she wanted to start living with him right away, and so she too moved into his house. At last they were a couple. Everything seemed to be going as peaceful as possible. Beatrice got up every morning and went to school, while Marco went to Rome offices of Le Figaro. They often spent their evenings in each other's arms in front of the open fire. These magical moments went on for about 6 months. Then one evening, Marco and Beatrice are in front of the fireplace in the lounge of the farmhouse. They are lying naked with their arms wrapped around each, other talking intimately. Beatrice says, "Let's go to sleep and try to dream the same dream." Marco pretends to start snoring, but at that moment, a gunshot shatters the silence of the room and a vase on the mantelpiece explodes. Marco realizes that the Secret Service have tracked him down. There is terror in his eyes, above all for Beatrice, who has never had anything to do with the virus affair. He would never be able to forgive himself if anything happened to her. More shots ring out in the silence of the tragic evening. Marco throws himself on the top of Beatrice to shield her body with his own, hoping to protect her from the deadly bullets. Beatrice is sobbing. Marco repeats over and over again, "Don't worry, baby. Don't worry, baby. Everything is going to be okay." Everything seems destined to a tragic end, when all of a sudden a whirl of strange yellow light appears, spinning round and round. Then, unclear at first, but then more defined, it reveals a small human figure, about 4 feet tall, squat and awkward, with thick, round, green glasses. Marco and Beatrice are twice as terrified. This is certainly not the time to be having a metaphysical experience. The little man introduces himself as Marilot and says that he is a natural phenomenon which appears to living beings only once in their lifetime, and that this always happens an hour before the death of each individual. At this point, their terror triples. Their eyes widen and their faces are white. Marilot calms them down by saying that he is not there to frighten them, but to make them happy. In fact, they can ask him for whatever they want and he will make it come true. Marco immediately asks that they be taken away from this horrible and unwelcome situation. Marilot obeys and transports him away in a whirl of light, adding though that it is just a temporary respite because at the end of that fatal hour they will still die. Now that they are at last far from these dramatic events, Marilot asks them why they found themselves in such dire strait. Although he knows everything about everyone, he can't know what happens in the last 3 days of a person's life, because it is that person that has to tell him. Marco, trusting Marilot completely, tells him everything. Marilot scratches his chin and replies, "You see what interfering with the course of history has led to? It doesn't matter whether your actions are motivated by good or evil. I just mean that in an hour you will unfortunately have to die. Your future is like a movie, each scene of which has already been filmed. And however much you run or cry or do anything, there is nothing you can do to prevent that which already is." As suddenly as he had appeared, Marilot wraps himself up in another spiral of yellow light and is swallowed up in nothing. Marco and Beatrice find themselves in the farmhouse again, where they had been 59 minutes earlier. Fresh gunfire rips through the air. Marco and Beatrice are at the end of their tether. Suddenly the door of the house bursts off its hinges. 5 masked men dressed in black come rushing in and start shooting at the 2 young naked bodies, which fall dead to the ground in a pool of blood, still holding hands. At last all is still. The night gives way to dawn. A cockerel crows. Marco and Beatrice stretch and wake up. They had only fallen asleep and really had dreamt the same terrible dream. Beatrice went to get up and knocked her foot against something. She looked to see what it is and discovers at her feet a pair of thick, round green glasses which remind her of something or someone. The end.